The neighborhood of Manassas, Virginia seemed picture perfect. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, friendly nods exchanged between neighbors, and the occasional laughter of children playing in the streets. But appearances could deceive. Inside the Bobbitt home, a storm brewed behind closed doors. Lorena glanced nervously at the clock on the wall. Its steady ticking only amplified her unease. John had promised to be home by 7 p.m., but as usual, he was late. The dinner she had carefully prepared, a mix of traditional Ecuadorian dishes and a few American staples, sat untouched on the kitchen table. The vibrant colors of the food now seemed dull under the kitchen's harsh fluorescent lights. She glanced out the window, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her apron. The dim light outside revealed a calm street, but her eyes were drawn to the shadowy figure of their neighbor, Mrs. Walker, watering her flowers. Mrs. Walker paused, looking towards the Bobbitt house for a moment too long before returning to her task. Lorena felt her cheeks flush with shame, wondering if the neighbors heard the argument from the previous night. The sound of a car door slamming jolted her back to reality. John was home. She hurriedly adjusted the silverware on the table, her heart pounding. The front door creaked open, followed by the heavy thud of his boots on the hardwood floor. "You couldn't even wait for me?" John's voice boomed as he entered the kitchen, his face red from what Lorena could already smell was a night of drinking. He threw his jacket onto a chair and grabbed a beer from the fridge without sparing her a glance. "I didn't know how long you'd be," Lorena began softly, but John's glare silenced her. He opened the beer with a sharp hiss, leaning back against the counter. "Next time, just wait," he snapped, his words cutting like a blade. "It's not that hard." Lorena swallowed hard, the familiar lump rising in her throat. She had long learned not to push back. Instead, she sat quietly at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of John's bottle hitting the counter. The tension thickened when the phone rang. Lorena reached for it instinctively, but John beat her to it. Snatching the receiver, he barked, "Who is this?" His tone shifted instantly from irritation to amusement. "Oh, hey, man, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow." As John's voice grew jovial, Lorena stared down at her hands. The call wasn't for her. It never was. Yet she felt the sting of his casual dismissal. Her eyes wandered to the vase sitting on the counter, its once bright yellow flowers now wilted. Much like her marriage, she thought grimly. When John finally hung up, he barely acknowledged her. He grabbed his jacket, muttered something about heading out again, and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Lorena alone once more. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes lingering on the untouched dinner. For a moment she contemplated cleaning up, but instead she stood frozen, the weight of the night pressing down on her chest. The ticking clock filled the silence, each second stretching into an eternity. Outside, Mrs. Walker glanced up from her garden again, her gaze fixed on the darkened windows of the Bobbitt house. The morning after John's abrupt departure was eerily quiet. Lorena sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty plate she hadn't touched the night before. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. She rubbed her temples, replaying John's words from the night before. The weight of his constant dismissiveness had begun to feel unbearable. At work, Lorena tried to focus on her clients. The buzz of nail drills and casual chatter around her provided a temporary distraction, but her mind wandered. Maria, her co-worker, noticed her unusual silence. As the two cleaned their stations during a rare lull in customers, Maria leaned in. "Lorena," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear, "you don't look like yourself today. Is everything okay?" Lorena hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down a table. She wanted to tell Maria everything, the fights, the drinking, the way John's words cut deeper than any blade ever could. But the shame held her back. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maria didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she gently squeezed Lorena's arm. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." As the day dragged on, Lorena's thoughts grew darker. That night, when she returned home, the house was empty again. The air felt heavier than usual, and the silence was deafening. She made her way to the living room and froze. A crumpled receipt lay on the coffee table. Picking it up, her heart sank. It was from a local bar, a bar she had never been to. The timestamp matched the hours John had been working late just last week. She clenched the receipt in her fist, anger bubbling up inside her. But then came the familiar wave of doubt. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe she was overthinking things. Yet deep down, she knew better. The next evening, Lorena decided to confront John. When he finally walked through the door, she stood in the kitchen, the receipt clutched in her hand. "John," she said, her voice firmer than usual. "What is this?" John barely glanced at the receipt before snatching it from her hand. "Why are you snooping through my things?" he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. "I wasn't snooping," Lorena shot back, her voice shaking. "It was on the table. You said you were working late, but this says otherwise." John's laugh was cold and mocking. "Are you accusing me of something, Lorena? Because that would be a big mistake." For the first time, Lorena didn't back down. "I just want to know the truth, John." The room fell silent. John stepped closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her. "You don't want to play this game with me," he said quietly, his tone dripping with menace. Lorena's hands trembled, but she refused to look away. She held his gaze, a small flicker of defiance in her eyes. But when John abruptly turned and walked away, slamming the bedroom door behind him, the flicker extinguished. She sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. The cracks in their marriage, once hidden beneath the surface, were now impossible to ignore. Lorena felt trapped, unsure of how much more she could endure. The days that followed felt like a blur to Lorena. Each moment with John was heavier than the last, and the air in their home seemed suffocating. The receipt had been thrown in the trash, but its weight lingered in her mind. Despite her defiance, she felt the familiar grip of helplessness tighten around her. One morning at work, Lorena's coworker Maria noticed her quiet demeanor. "Lorena," Maria began softly as they cleaned their stations. "Are you okay? You've been so quiet lately, more than usual." Lorena hesitated. She looked down at her hands, which trembled as they held a bottle of nail polish remover. Her lips parted, but no words came out. How could she explain the chaos of her life to someone who seemed so put together? Maria reached over, gently placing a hand on Lorena's arm. "You don't have to tell me everything, but you can't keep it all inside. I've been there." Lorena's eyes widened. She hadn't expected that. "Been where?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Maria sighed and sat down beside her. "It was years ago before I came here," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I was married to a man who thought he owned me. Every word I spoke, every move I made, it was like walking on eggshells. And when I tried to leave..." Her voice trailed off and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Lorena felt a pang in her chest. She recognized the pain in Maria's eyes. It was a mirror of her own. How did you get out?" she whispered. Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a small, crumpled card. "I called this number," she said, pressing it into Lorena's hand. "They helped me see that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't alone, and they can help you too, if you're ready." Lorena stared at the card. It was a hotline for victims of domestic violence. She felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief that someone understood her pain, but fear of what might happen if John ever found out. The bell above the salon door jingled, breaking the moment. A customer walked in, and Maria gave Lorena's hand a reassuring squeeze before returning to work. Lorena slipped the card into her pocket, her heart racing. That evening, Lorena stood in the kitchen, staring at the card. She picked up the phone several times, her fingers trembling over the dial, but each time she put it back down. Her mind swirled with questions. What if they couldn't help? What if John found out? What if she was making everything worse? The sound of John's car pulling into the driveway snapped her out of her thoughts. She stuffed the card into her apron pocket and quickly busied herself with dinner. When John walked in, his mood seemed lighter than usual, as if he had forgotten their argument. He kissed her cheek, a rare gesture, and Lorena forced a smile. But the card in her pocket felt like a burning secret, a tiny spark of hope that she wasn't sure she was ready to ignite. Later that night, as John slept soundly beside her, Lorena reached for the card again. This time she dialed the number. The line rang once, twice, and then a calm, reassuring voice answered. "Thank you for calling. How can we help you?" Lorena's throat tightened and tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, she spoke the words she had been holding inside. "I need help," she whispered. The days that followed seemed like an endless cycle. Lorena spent her time trying to ignore the growing tension between her and John. He had become increasingly distant, and his late-night absences were becoming harder to overlook. The house was quiet, except for the occasional sound of the television in the background, where John spent most of his evenings after coming home drunk. Lorena would sit in the kitchen, pretending to be occupied with small tasks. but her mind would race with thoughts she couldn't share. One afternoon, as she cleaned the counters, her phone buzzed with a message from Maria. "You okay? I'm thinking of you." Lorena stared at the text for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of what she knew. Maria had offered her an escape, a glimpse of hope, but Lorena wasn't sure she was ready. Not yet. The doorbell rang, breaking her concentration. She opened the door to find their neighbor, Mrs. Walker, standing on the porch with a small bag of groceries in her hand. "Oh, hi, Lorena. Just thought I'd drop these off," Mrs. Walker said with a smile, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet recognition of the tension in the air. "How's everything going?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Lorena forced a smile, quickly dismissing the thought that Mrs. Walker might know what was happening behind closed doors. "It's fine. Just busy," she replied, not meeting her gaze. Mrs. Walker nodded but lingered for a moment. "If you ever need anything, someone to talk to or help with the yard." Lorena nodded politely, closing the door quickly. She felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. Mrs. Walker wasn't blind. She knew something was off. But what could she do? Everyone had their own problems, right? That night, when John stumbled in hours later than usual, Lorena was in the kitchen, her hands still moving mechanically, trying to keep her mind distracted. John's mood was volatile, as it always was after a night of drinking. "What's for dinner?" he barked as he walked through the door, his voice harsh. Lorena didn't answer right away, and John's irritation grew. "Did you hear me? I asked what's for dinner." She flinched at the sharpness of his tone, but kept her composure. "I made chicken," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. John grabbed the plate, his eyes narrowed as he studied her. "You're not saying much tonight. What's wrong with you?" he asked, almost mocking her. Lorena wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. She had no fight left in her. The last time she had spoken her mind, it hadn't gone well. She glanced at him briefly, then lowered her gaze. John shoved a bite of food into his mouth, chewing without saying anything else. The silence between them was deafening, but it wasn't the silence that bothered her. It was the weight of what it represented. It was the silence of a marriage slowly suffocating. The next morning, Lorena woke up early, trying to find some peace in the quiet before John woke up. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight casting a soft glow over the room. She opened the small note from Maria again, feeling a twinge of guilt for not taking that first step toward freedom. But could she really do it? Could she leave? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of John stirring in the bedroom. She put the note down quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Her gaze lingered on the small bottle of painkillers on the counter, something she had never used, but had kept close for a long time. It was just a small way to numb the pain, even if only for a moment. John entered the kitchen, still wearing his rumpled clothes from the night before. His eyes were bloodshot and his movements were sluggish. "You up early," he muttered, his tone laced with irritation. "What's with all the quiet?" Lorena didn't answer. She simply picked up her coffee cup and took a sip, trying to steady her nerves. John scoffed. "What? You can't even talk to me now?" he sneered, his voice rising. Lorena felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach, the suffocating tension that followed him everywhere. She stood up, not wanting to engage in another argument. "I'm just tired," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. John snorted and shook his head, turning to leave. But before he did, he glanced back at her with a look of cold indifference. "Well, don't get too comfortable. I'll be gone again soon." As he walked out the door, Lorena let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. For a moment, it felt as if the weight had been lifted, but only for a moment. She knew the storm was coming again, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Lorena woke up with the familiar ache in her chest. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence that filled the room. John was still asleep, his breathing heavy and uneven. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting shadows across the bed. Lorena stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the previous night, the fight, the shouting, the look in his eyes when he accused her of overreacting. She had always tried to be quiet, to avoid pushing him too far. But last night something had shifted inside her. She wasn't sure when it happened, whether it was the years of tension building up or the years of silence she had swallowed down. But now it was as if the dam had finally broken. John stirred, groaning as he woke up. He turned over and pulled her into his arms, his breath smelling of alcohol. He didn't say anything, just held her there, but Lorena felt the coldness that had settled between them. She pulled away, sitting up in bed. The room was still dark, but the weight of the moment felt too heavy to ignore. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the tangled hair from her face. "John, we need to talk," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. He didn't respond immediately, but Lorena could feel him watching her. She didn't look back at him. She couldn't. The anger was rising inside her, and she feared that if she looked him in the eye, she might say something she couldn't take back. "What's there to talk about?" John finally muttered, still half asleep. "You're always on my case. I don't need this." Her pulse quickened. The words she had been holding in for so long suddenly felt like they might spill out. She took a deep breath and stood up, pacing the room. "I'm not your servant, John," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not here just to clean up after you, to be ignored, to—" "Here we go again," he interrupted, sitting up and rubbing his face. "You're acting crazy. Why don't you just drop it?" The words stung more than they should have. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. But every time she tried to speak her mind, he made her feel like she was. She looked at him, the man she once loved, but now all she could see was someone who didn't care about her pain or her fear. "You don't get it, do you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't see what you're doing to me." John's eyes narrowed, his frustration growing. "What do you want me to say, Lorena? You want me to apologize for everything? For what?" Lorena's breath caught in her throat. The question wasn't new, but it cut deeper than ever before. Did she want him to apologize? Did she want him to acknowledge the years of control, the years of him telling her that her feelings didn't matter? The tears that had been welling up inside her finally spilled over, streaking down her face. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by her vulnerability, but there was no stopping them now. "Please, just stop," she choked out. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." John's expression softened, but only for a second. He stood up, walking past her without a word, as if her breakdown meant nothing. Lorena's heart shattered at the sight. The man she had given everything to, the man who promised to love her, couldn't even acknowledge her pain. She stood there frozen, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. She could feel the walls closing in on her, and for the first time in years, she didn't know how much more she could take. The silence stretched on, both of them standing in the same space but worlds apart. The weight of the unspoken words hung heavily between them. Then, without another word, John grabbed his jacket and left the room. He didn't even glance at her. Lorena sank to the floor, her body trembling. She was done pretending. She was done with the silence, done with the lies, done with him. The truth was clear now, even if it had always been hiding in plain sight. Her heart ached, but for the first time she felt something else, something small but significant, a spark, a flicker of hope, even if she didn't know what it meant yet. The house was still when Lorena returned that evening. The quiet had become unbearable, like the calm before a storm. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the weight of the day pulling her down with every step. The moment John left, a silence filled the house, empty and deafening. It seemed to echo the isolation she had felt for so long. She barely even noticed that he hadn't come home again that night. She moved mechanically, folding the laundry and tidying up, not really seeing what she was doing. Her mind kept returning to the confrontation they'd had that morning, the anger she had felt, the helplessness. For the first time she had spoken out, and yet John had barely acknowledged it. Every word she'd said had fallen on deaf ears. His indifference to her pain was suffocating. It felt like he had been ignoring her for years, but now it had become too much. Her eyes drifted to the kitchen knife on the counter. It wasn't new. It had always been there, sharp and functional. She had used it countless times to prepare meals, to slice vegetables, to serve dinner. But tonight it was different. It felt menacing, like it had taken on a dark power. She stared at it, feeling an overwhelming wave of frustration wash over her. She reached for the knife, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the handle. Her mind raced, but everything felt disconnected, as if she was outside herself, watching her own actions. She had never thought of herself as someone capable of violence, but tonight, something had snapped inside her. It wasn't just John's betrayal, it was everything. The years of insults, the fear, the isolation, the constant tension, the silent tears she had cried in the darkness of their bed. The sound of the door slamming open jolted her from her thoughts. John was back. She quickly dropped the knife, stuffing her shaking hands into her pockets as he stepped into the room. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. John didn't respond immediately. He just glanced at her, a scowl forming on his face. His shirt was unbuttoned, his hair a mess. He had been drinking again, and it was obvious from the way he staggered toward the kitchen. "What's your problem now?" he muttered, as if everything was her fault. Lorena felt the anger begin to bubble up again, but this time there was something more, something darker, something more dangerous. She had had enough. "You don't even see it, do you?" she said through gritted teeth. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything she had been holding in. John looked up, his eyes narrowing. "See what?" "You," she said, choking back a sob. "You don't see how you've broken me, how you've made me feel like nothing, how you've stolen everything from me." John's face twisted in mockery. "You're crazy, Lorena. Always complaining, always whining." Lorena felt her chest tighten as the tears threatened to spill over. Her hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world was pressing in on her. She was trapped in this small house with no escape, no one to turn to, no way out. "Just leave me alone," she whispered, not even sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. John, as if on cue, turned away, muttering something under his breath. He didn't care. He never cared. And that was it. The final blow. The last straw. She couldn't take it anymore. In a split second, the rage inside her erupted, and before she even knew what was happening, she grabbed the knife again. Her fingers felt numb as she held it, the cold metal pressing into her palm. The sound of the door opening again startled her, but she didn't stop. The voice of the 911 operator echoed in her ears, as if it was a distant memory. She remembered the conversation earlier, but now, the operator's words were drowned out by the pounding in her chest, the need for release. Her breath was shallow, her mind spinning. She felt like she was watching everything unfold from a distance, as if someone else was controlling her body. But she wasn't in control. She wasn't in control of anything anymore. John turned around, his eyes locking onto hers as he took in the sight of the knife. His face hardened. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he sneered. Lorena didn't answer. The only thing she could do was hold the knife tightly, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had built up. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she couldn't stop. Lorena's hands shook violently as she gripped the knife. Her body felt disconnected, her movements robotic, as if someone else was controlling her. She didn't even notice the weight of the steel pressing against her palm, nor did she register the chaos that was unfolding. All she could hear was the loud pounding of her own heart, her breath coming in shallow gasps. John turned around, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. His words were a blur, just sounds as he stepped toward her. "What the hell are you doing, Lorena?" His voice cracked with disbelief, but the venom in it was undeniable. Lorena didn't answer. She couldn't. The words she needed to say, everything she had bottled up, wouldn't come out. The knife felt heavy now, a symbol of everything she had endured. She had never imagined it would come to this, but here she was, standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. "Put that down, Lorena," John snapped, but she didn't move. "You're crazy." The words stung. How many times had he called her that? How many times had he belittled her, made her feel like she was losing her mind? But now, with the knife in her hand, she didn't feel crazy. She felt desperate. She heard the distant sound of the wind outside, a soft whisper of the life that was still going on outside the walls of their house. It was as if the world was urging her to stop, but the grip of her own anger and fear was too strong to ignore. John's voice cut through the haze of her thoughts. "Don't you dare, Lorena," he warned, stepping closer. He was no longer shouting, but the tension was palpable. The air between them was thick, charged with the electricity of years of unspoken pain and frustration. Lorena's breath caught in her throat. This was it. There was no going back from here. In a sudden, almost instinctive movement, Lorena bolted out of the kitchen, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't think, didn't plan. She just needed to get out. She grabbed her keys from the counter and ran to the car. As she slammed the car door shut, she felt the coldness of the night air pressing against her skin. Her hands still trembled as she started the engine and sped off into the darkness. Her mind was a blur, her thoughts scattered like the wind, but one thing was clear. She couldn't go back to him. Not anymore. The streets were empty, and the world outside felt distant, surreal. Lorena drove aimlessly, unsure of where she was headed or what she was doing. The only thing she knew was that she couldn't stay. Not in that house, not with him. As she drove, her thoughts swirled, torn between panic and a strange sense of release. She had taken the first step. She had left. She had chosen herself over everything she had known. And then, it hit her. She needed help. Her hands still shook, but now, her thoughts were clearer. The number Maria had given her, the hotline, she needed to call. Lorena fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number. She was about to end it, everything she had ever known, and yet she was still afraid. But this time, she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The phone rang once, twice. The third time, a calm voice answered. "Thank you for calling. How can we help you today?" Lorena choked on her breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. The woman on the other end of the line was patient, soft, kind. She didn't rush Lorena. She listened. "It's okay," the woman said. "You're not alone. We can help you." Lorena closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. The sound of sirens cut through the night air as Lorena sped through the streets, her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Her pulse raced, and her mind was spinning. She had left. She had taken the first step. But now, the chaos that followed felt like an avalanche, relentless and unforgiving. As she drove, her phone rang. The display showed an unknown number, but Lorena answered anyway, her breath coming in short gasps. "Lorena?" It was Maria's voice on the other end. "Lorena, what happened? I saw the news." Lorena's heart sank. She hadn't even thought about what the neighbors might say. The neighbors had probably heard everything. Mrs. Walker, who had quietly watched the tension build, now had a front row seat to the aftermath. "Maria, I don't know what to do," Lorena said, her voice trembling. "I can't stay with him anymore. I need to get away." "Lorena, listen to me," Maria said, her tone firm but gentle. "You did the right thing. You have to stay calm. You need help. There are people who can help you." Lorena didn't respond right away. She was trying to steady her breath, trying to hold on to the feeling that she wasn't completely alone. She wasn't sure if she was still in control or if the panic had taken over. Meanwhile, back at the house, John was waking up, disoriented. The night had been a blur of drunken arguments, but something was different now. He noticed the absence. Lorena was gone. The house was eerily quiet, and for the first time he felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. The door was still open when he stumbled into the kitchen. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of where she might have gone. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger and panic. He couldn't fathom where she might have run off to. He picked up the phone, dialing her number. The line rang once, twice, but it went to voicemail. He cursed under his breath, pacing the room. "Where the hell are you?" he muttered to himself. Back in the car, Lorena's hands were slick with sweat, her fingers sliding on the steering wheel as she approached a deserted road. The call with Maria had given her a glimmer of reassurance, but now her mind was clouded with doubt. Should she have stayed? Should she have tried harder to make things work? The guilt was eating at her. Suddenly, her headlights caught the faint outline of something on the road ahead. It was a figure, standing motionless like a ghost in the darkness. She slowed the car, her heart skipping a beat as she saw it was a police officer. The officer motioned for her to pull over, and with a shaky breath, she obeyed. She rolled down the window, her stomach twisting in knots. The officer leaned in, his eyes scanning her face. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Lorena nodded, trying to steady her breath, but she could feel the tears welling up again. I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I just left. I don't want to go back." The officer's gaze softened. He took a step back, placing a hand on the car door. "Are you in danger, ma'am?" Lorena hesitated, the truth weighing heavily on her. "I'm not sure, but I'm scared. I had to leave." The officer's expression hardened slightly, but it wasn't judgment. It was concern. "I understand. Do you need assistance? We can call someone for you." Lorena's hands trembled as she pulled the phone from her pocket. She glanced down at the number Maria had given her again, the small sliver of hope that had started to grow within her. As she dialed the number, the officer nodded. "It's okay, you're doing the right thing. We'll make sure you're safe." The phone rang once, then twice. Lorena's breath quickened, her fingers shaking as she waited for the voice on the other end. "Thank you for calling. How can we help you today?" A calm, reassuring voice answered. Lorena closed her eyes, finally feeling the weight of the moment. She had made the first step. She had left. And now she was ready to ask for the help she so desperately needed. The following hours passed in a blur. The police had been called, the sirens a distant sound that seemed to echo endlessly in Lorena's mind. She sat on the cold bench at the station, her eyes darting around the room, barely registering the noise around her. The officer had given her a blanket, but it felt like a thin layer between her and the world that was crashing down. Her phone buzzed, and she jumped, startled. It was a message from Maria. "Are you okay? I saw it on the news, Lorena. Is everything all right?" Lorena's hands trembled as she typed back. "I'm at the station. I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart." She could hear her own voice breaking, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. Her breath was shallow, her pulse erratic. She had never imagined it would come to this. She had just wanted to escape, but now the whole world seemed to be watching. As she stared at the screen, the words on the news replayed in her mind. "Breaking news. A woman has reportedly cut off her husband's genitals in an apparent act of self-defense. Police are investigating the incident as part of an ongoing domestic violence case." The words were cold, impersonal, and yet they were about her. The frenzy had begun. The reporters were already circling like vultures, trying to get a piece of the story. And Lorena felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. There was no turning back now. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Looking up, she saw the officer who had spoken to her earlier, his expression calm but concerned. "Lorena, we need to talk. We have a few questions for you," he said gently. Lorena nodded, following him into the small interview room. She sat across from him, her mind spinning. He asked the usual questions, ones that felt irrelevant to the storm raging inside her. Her answers were brief, hesitant, her thoughts scattered. She wasn't sure what was happening anymore, just that everything was changing, unraveling in ways she didn't understand. "They found John," the officer said after a long silence. His voice was grave. "He's in the hospital. He's stable, but they're still treating him." A lump formed in Lorena's throat. She had done what she did out of desperation, out of the need to escape a life she could no longer live. But hearing those words sent a wave of guilt through her. What if it was too much? What if she had gone too far? The officer watched her closely, as if waiting for some sort of reaction. But all Lorena could feel was emptiness. She couldn't even process the magnitude of what she had done, the consequences that were now unfolding. As the officer left the room to make a phone call, Lorena's thoughts turned inward. She could hear the chaos outside, sirens, the murmur of voices, the faint clicks of cameras snapping photos. The entire world was now focused on her, her actions dissected and turned into a media spectacle. She had become a symbol, not just of self-defense, but of something larger, something that everyone had an opinion about. She felt exposed, as if there was nowhere to hide. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Maria. "You did what you had to do. I'm here for you." The words were a lifeline, but Lorena wasn't sure she could hold on. The storm had just begun, and she had no idea where it would end. She had left the man who had controlled her for so long, but now it seemed like everyone had a part to play in her story, whether she wanted them to or not. The officer returned, sitting down across from her. "We're going to need to take a formal statement, Lorena," he said. "But you need to understand, this is a serious matter. You've been accused of a crime." The weight of the words crashed down on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, for everything that was about to unfold. The frenzy had already begun, and she had no choice but to ride it out. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of whispered conversations filling the room as the trial against John Bobbitt began. Lorena sat in the front row, her hands tightly clasped together in her lap. Her heart pounded in her chest, and despite the coolness of the room, she felt an overwhelming heat rising in her body. The glare of the lights above her felt almost unbearable. John sat across from her, his face stony and unreadable. His expression seemed cold, as if he had detached himself from the proceedings entirely. His lawyer sat beside him, whispering into his ear, occasionally glancing at Lorena's direction. She couldn't look at him for long. Every time she did, she felt a pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of the actions that had brought them both to this point. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. The prosecutor, a tall woman with a stern demeanor, rose to present the case. Her voice was clear and authoritative as she outlined the charges against John: sexual assault and physical abuse. She spoke of the evidence, the testimonies of Lorena and other witnesses, all detailing the abuse John had allegedly inflicted on his wife. Lorena's throat tightened as she listened. She'd been so afraid to speak the truth, but now, as the prosecutor laid everything out, it was all coming to the surface. The years of abuse, the lies, the manipulation. Her heart ached as she recalled the pain and fear she had lived with for so long. As the prosecutor spoke, John's lawyer stood, ready to respond. His tone was calm, almost soothing, as he painted a very different picture. He claimed that Lorena had made up the allegations, that she was unstable, that the whole thing had been an act of revenge. He suggested that Lorena's accusations were an exaggeration, that John had never truly hurt her, and that she had overreacted when things went wrong between them. Lorena's breath caught in her throat. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud in front of everyone was like a slap in the face. How could he stand there and deny everything? How could he twist the truth so easily? Her mind flashed back to the night when it all came crashing down. The fear, the anger, the helplessness she had felt as she stood there in that kitchen, facing him. Her hands clenched into fists as the memories came rushing back. She had never wanted to hurt him, but she had been pushed to the edge. She had fought for years, silently, trying to hold it all together, but in that moment she had lost control. She fought back tears as the lawyer continued, painting her as a desperate woman looking for an excuse. Lorena could feel the weight of the words pushing down on her, but then she remembered the phone call, the moment she had reached out for help, the moment she had taken the first step toward freedom. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't making it up. The years of pain had been real. As the lawyer's questioning continued, Lorena felt the eyes of the courtroom on her. She could hear the whispers behind her, feel the weight of judgment on her shoulders. She had to testify. She had to speak the truth. Finally, the judge turned to Lorena. "Mrs. Bobbitt, would you please take the stand?" Her heart pounded as she stood, her legs unsteady as she made her way to the witness stand. The room seemed to close in around her, and for a moment, everything went silent. She could feel the sweat on her palms, the trembling of her hands as she placed them on the stand. She glanced briefly at John, who was staring ahead, his face expressionless. She couldn't look at him for too long, it was too painful. The prosecutor gently prompted her to speak, and Lorena cleared her throat. The words came out slowly, but they were her words, her truth. She told the court about the years of abuse, the fear, the control, and the way John had manipulated her. She spoke of the emotional and physical scars he had left, of the moments she had felt trapped, of the times she had believed she had no escape. Her voice cracked as she recalled the night everything changed, when she had finally reached her breaking point. She spoke of the rage she had felt, the terror, the desperation. She spoke of the moment she had taken the knife, not because she wanted to harm him, but because she had no other choice. The courtroom was silent when she finished. She could feel the weight of the truth in the air, and for the first time, she didn't feel ashamed. She had finally spoken, and it was her voice, her story, her truth. Lorena sat in the courtroom, her heart racing. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead seemed to intensify the silence that filled the room. The walls seemed to close in on her as she shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, her palms sweaty against the cool wood. Today was her turn. The tables had turned, and now she was the one facing the courtroom's scrutiny. Across the room, John sat with his lawyer, his face unreadable. Lorena had avoided looking at him for most of the trial, but now she could feel his eyes on her, cold and unforgiving. It was as if he was daring her to say something, to break, to show weakness. But she couldn't let him win. She couldn't afford to let him see her falter. The prosecutor began with the same questions that had been asked 1,000 times. Lorena answered them as best as she could, recounting the events leading up to the night she had cut off John's genitalia. Her voice was steady but quiet, each word coming with the weight of years of pain. She spoke of the years of emotional abuse, the isolation, the fear. She told the jury about the endless nights of him coming home drunk, the yelling, the insults, the manipulation. "I felt trapped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was no way out. I didn't know how to escape anymore." Her eyes flickered to the jury, but she couldn't make herself look directly at them. Instead, she focused on the prosecutor, who nodded in encouragement. But then, the defense attorney rose, and Lorena felt her heart drop. He was about to cross-examine her. "Mrs. Bobbitt," the defense attorney began, his voice smooth and measured, You claim that you acted out of self-defense, that you were pushed to the breaking point. But isn't it true that you had planned this for some time? That you had been harboring anger toward your husband? Lorena's breath caught in her throat. The accusation stung. The room seemed to narrow around her as the defense lawyer continued. Isn't it true that you made up the story of abuse to justify your actions? She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her now, their gaze heavy and judgmental. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she fought to keep her voice steady. No, she said firmly, shaking her head. I didn't make it up. Everything I said was true. I've been living in fear for years. The lawyer didn't back down. And yet, you waited until he was asleep, defenseless, to carry out this act of violence. Isn't that true? Why didn't you confront him earlier? Why didn't you seek help? Lorena's hands trembled as she clenched them tightly in her lap. She knew he was trying to twist her words, make her appear like the villain in this story. But she wasn't the villain. She wasn't the one who had caused this chaos. I was scared, Lorena whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to do anymore. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't leave. He controlled everything. I thought if I spoke up, if I left, he would kill me. The room fell silent. Lorena's words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. She could see the faint shift in the jurors' faces. She could feel their eyes soften, a flicker of understanding in their gazes. The defense attorney took a step back, seemingly caught off guard by her response. The prosecutor nodded, and Lorena felt a brief sense of relief. She had told the truth finally. She had spoken her heart. It was all she could do. The rest of the day passed in a blur of questions, cross-examinations, and arguments. But through it all, Lorena stood firm. She answered each question with the same honesty and conviction, even when the defense tried to break her down. She could feel herself growing stronger with every answer, every moment she held her ground. By the time the session ended, Lorena felt drained, her body heavy with the weight of what had happened. She had survived her turn in the courtroom, but she knew that the battle was far from over. Her fate was now in the hands of the jury, and she could only hope that they would understand her pain, her desperation, her fight for freedom. As she left the courtroom, her heart still pounding, she caught a glimpse of Maria waiting for her outside. Maria's expression was filled with concern, but also with a glimmer of hope. Don't worry, Maria said, pulling Lorena into a hug. You did it. You told your story. You're not alone. Lorena clung to her friend's words, trying to hold on to the small spark of hope that had begun to light the darkness. The courtroom was quieter than it had been throughout the trial, but the tension was palpable. Lorena sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind racing with uncertainty. The trial was nearing its end, and now it was up to the jury. She could feel the weight of their stares, the murmurs in the gallery, and the suffocating pressure of public opinion. The media frenzy had grown exponentially since the beginning of the trial. Lorena had become a symbol, either a victim of years of abuse or a woman who had taken a dangerous step too far. The news outlets had been relentless in their coverage, speculating on the truth, painting their own versions of the events. Headlines flashed across television screens with commentators split down the middle, unable to agree on what her actions meant. Some called her a hero, a woman who had fought back after enduring relentless abuse. Others painted her as a criminal, a woman who had taken a life-altering step without considering the consequences. The opinions of the public mirrored those of the jury, divided, unsure, and questioning. Lorena's mind kept returning to the night of the incident, the moment when everything had changed. She had been pushed to the edge, but now, faced with the aftermath, she couldn't help but wonder if there was another way. If only she had done something sooner. If only she had left before it got to this point. Her thoughts were interrupted as the judge called the jury to deliberate. Lorena felt a knot in her stomach as they filed out of the room, their expressions unreadable. She looked at Maria, who had been with her through the whole process. Maria gave her a small, encouraging smile, but even she knew that the next few hours could change everything. The defense attorney, who had been so confident throughout the trial, leaned in. "We've done everything we can," he said quietly. "The jury will take time, but we've made our case." Lorena nodded, but inside she felt like everything was slipping away. The fear had been with her for so long. Fear of John, fear of being alone, fear of the unknown. Now that fear had turned into something else, something more intense. The fear of the outcome, the fear of not knowing how this would end. Outside the courtroom, the press had gathered in a frenzy. Reporters from all over the country were swarming the building, eager for a glimpse of the woman at the center of it all. Lorena had become the story, and as much as she wished it wasn't true, she had no choice but to be in the spotlight. Lorena Bobbitt, victim or villain? One headline screamed. The shocking case of self-defense or revenge? Her stomach turned as she read the various interpretations of her story. Some outlets painted her as a tragic figure, forced into a corner and left with no choice but to lash out. Others claimed that she was a woman scorned, acting out of bitterness and rage. Every version felt like a betrayal. None of them captured the truth of what she had lived through. As the day wore on, the anxiety in the courtroom grew thicker. The jury had been deliberating for hours. Lorena found herself staring at the clock, each second passing like an eternity. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, drowning out the noise around her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The room fell silent as they took their seats. The foreman stood up, holding a piece of paper, and Lorena's breath caught in her throat. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge called. Lorena stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, some full of sympathy, others full of judgment. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest. The foreman began to speak, his voice steady but emotionless. "We, the jury, find the defendant." Lorena closed her eyes, waiting for the words that would determine her fate. Time seemed to stretch on, the world frozen in that moment. "Not guilty." A gasp rippled through the room. Lorena's eyes flew open, her breath hitching in her throat. The weight of the words sank in slowly. She wasn't guilty. She wasn't going to prison. The relief was almost overwhelming, but it came with a strange, bitter aftertaste. She had been vindicated, but at what cost? The room erupted in noise. Some cheered, others sat in stunned silence. The defense attorney was already smiling, shaking hands with the jurors, while the prosecutor remained stone-faced, clearly disappointed. Lorena felt a wave of dizziness wash over her as the realization set in. She was free, for now at least. She turned to Maria, her best friend, who had tears in her eyes. "You did it," Maria whispered, her voice full of emotion. Lorena nodded, unable to speak. She had won, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was still in turmoil. The trial might be over, but the world would continue to watch her, judge her, and question her. Her mind was still racing, unsure of what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a chance to rebuild, a chance to live without fear. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Lorena stood beside her lawyer, her palms clammy as she gripped the edge of the table. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of the jury, the soft clink of the courtroom clock, felt like a distant echo. The world outside might as well have ceased to exist. All that mattered was the moment she was waiting for, the moment that would decide her fate. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't dare look at anyone. Instead, she stared straight ahead, trying to steady her breath, willing the panic rising in her chest to subside. Her mind was spinning with all the emotion she had pushed down in the past few weeks. The relief, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all mixing together in a way that made her feel like she might break. Her hands shook as she tried to focus, but every passing second seemed to drag on endlessly. The jury had already deliberated for hours, and now they were back. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper in his hand. Lorena's throat tightened as he glanced at the judge. "Will the defendant please rise?" The judge's voice cut through the heavy silence, pulling Lorena out of her thoughts. With a deep breath, Lorena slowly stood up. Her legs felt like jelly beneath her, and she had to fight the urge to collapse back into the chair. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She could already feel the weight of the verdict in the air, like a storm gathering just out of reach. The foreman spoke, his voice steady but carrying a heaviness that made Lorena's heart race. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended, as if time had stopped. Lorena's breath hitched. She could feel the gaze of every person in the room on her, and she clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. "Not guilty," the foreman finished. The words hit Lorena like a tidal wave, washing over her in an overwhelming rush. For a split second, everything felt surreal. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed if not for the hand that caught her arm, steadying her. She didn't know if it was the relief or the exhaustion, but something inside her gave way. A gasp rippled through the room, followed by a brief silence. Lorena's eyes flickered to the jury, her gaze sweeping over their faces. Some were nodding, others with stoic expressions, but she couldn't tell if they truly understood the gravity of what they had just done. She wasn't sure if she understood it yet. The prosecutor sat in disbelief, her hands still on the table as if she was waiting for the judge to correct the mistake. The defense lawyer stood up, his face breaking into a smile, shaking hands with the jurors. Lorena's head spun. Was this real? Was this truly happening? Had she really been freed from the nightmare that had dominated her life for so long? She glanced at her lawyer, who gave her a reassuring nod. His expression was calm, but Lorena could see the quiet triumph in his eyes. She had been exonerated, but there was no joy in her heart. There was only exhaustion. Exhaustion from the trial, from the media frenzy, from the years of abuse that had led her here. She felt someone's presence beside her, Maria, her best friend. Maria had been there through everything, sitting in the front row, watching her fight for her freedom. Lorena's eyes filled with tears as Maria took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "You did it," Maria whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Lorena's chest tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but found that she couldn't form the words. She had won, but at what cost? Her life, her story, had been laid bare for everyone to see. She had faced John's accusations, the media's scrutiny, and now the verdict had come down in her favor. But the world had changed. Her world had changed. As she looked around the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. But what that beginning meant, Lorena wasn't sure. She had survived. She had been given her freedom. But there was still so much left to heal, so much more to understand. For now, she clung to the one thing that mattered. She had a future that was no longer dictated by fear, no longer controlled by someone else. Her gaze moved to the door, and for the first time in a long time, Lorena felt a faint spark of hope. The days following the trial felt like a blur, a whirlwind of interviews, media attention, and emotions Lorena wasn't sure she was ready to process. She had been declared not guilty, but the verdict didn't bring her the peace she had expected. Instead, it brought a new kind of pressure, a weight of expectations from a world that had been watching her every move. Lorena sat in her small apartment, the familiar hum of the city outside her window contrasting with the stillness inside. The world had shifted around her, but it felt like she was still standing in the same place, frozen in time. The trial was over, the decision had been made, but the scars, both visible and invisible, lingered. Maria visited frequently, sitting with her for hours, offering comfort and support when words were inadequate. "How are you really feeling?" Maria asked one afternoon as they sat together, their coffee mugs growing cold between them. Lorena's gaze lingered on the window, watching the traffic pass by. It had been days since the trial ended, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The cameras were gone, but the feeling of being under a microscope remained. "I don't know," she replied quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought this would be over, but it's not. I'm free, but I feel like I'm still trapped." Maria nodded, understanding more than words could convey. "It's normal. You've been through so much. It's going to take time to heal." But Lorena wasn't sure how much time it would take. She still remembered the fear and the anger, the weight of each moment leading up to that night, and the consequences of her actions. The relief from the verdict hadn't quieted the storm inside her. If anything, it had made her confront everything she had been running from. As the days passed, Lorena's life began to shift in subtle ways. The public's opinion of her remained divided. Some saw her as a victim, others as a villain. She couldn't escape the whispers that followed her, the questions that seemed to hang in the air wherever she went. The world had written its narrative, and now it was trying to decide who she was in the aftermath. But as the weeks went on, something inside her started to change. The guilt that had gnawed at her, guilt over what had happened to John, guilt over what she had done, began to ease. She knew she could never undo what had been done, but she also knew she couldn't keep punishing herself for it. She had survived, she had fought back, and in doing so, had taken back a part of herself she thought was lost forever. One evening, as she walked through the park, a place she used to visit with John during calmer times, she stopped at a bench and sat down, staring out at the pond. The sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in a long time, Lorena felt a sense of peace, as if the storm inside her was beginning to calm. She thought about the future, the one that had seemed impossible just months ago. The fear of what came next, the worry about how she would rebuild her life, still lingered in the back of her mind. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a life outside of her past, a future she could shape on her own terms. In the distance, a family walked by, laughing together. Lorena watched them, her heart swelling with longing. She thought about what it would mean to have a family again, one built on love, not fear. A future that didn't have to be defined by what she had endured, but by what she would create. The thoughts swirled in her mind, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lorena closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the beauty of the world around her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she had the chance to shape it. The past had shaped her, yes, but it would not define her. Months had passed since the trial, and the weight of the world still pressed down on Lorena. She sat in her small apartment, looking out the window at the bustling city below. The noise of traffic, of life moving forward, felt distant. It had been hard to find peace. The media attention had died down, but the questions remained, the judgments lingering like shadows. Yet with each passing day, Lorena found herself reclaiming pieces of her life, trying to stitch together a future she could finally call her own. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria, as it often did these days. "Thinking of you, you're doing amazing, Lorena." Lorena smiled at the screen, but it wasn't the same smile she had forced before. This one was real, though it was still tender. She had come a long way since the trial, since that night that changed everything. Maria had been with her every step of the way, even when the road was uncertain, even when Lorena doubted herself. Lorena stood and walked over to her small table, picking up a photo frame. It was of her, Maria, and a few others, friends she had met in support groups over the past few months. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore, that there was life after the storm, a life she could start to build on her own terms. Her thoughts turned to the trial. The verdict had been a turning point. It was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder of the deep scars left behind. She hadn't just survived the night she had acted in desperation. She had survived years of abuse, years of control, years of silence. That was what people didn't always understand. The verdict was one thing, but the journey that had led her to that moment was another. Lorena felt a deep sense of gratitude for her survival. She thought back to the phone call with the counselor, the first moment she had asked for help. That moment had been her first step toward freedom. Now it wasn't just about survival, it was about healing. The world had tried to define her as a victim, and while the truth of what had happened to her could never be erased, Lorena knew she was more than that. She had become an advocate, speaking out about domestic violence, sharing her story with those who needed to hear it most. She was no longer afraid to use her voice. She had been to several events, standing in front of crowds of women, some familiar, some strangers, who had walked similar paths. She would share her story not with shame, but with strength. She had become a symbol of resilience for others who had lived through the darkness and were just beginning to see the light. The memory of that night was still vivid in her mind. The anger, the fear, the desperation, it had all felt so real. But as time passed, Lorena began to see her actions from a different perspective. She wasn't just a woman who had fought for her life. She was a woman who had found the courage to fight back against years of manipulation, against fear, and against control. As she stood before a crowd at one of her speaking engagements, Lorena looked out at the sea of faces, each one carrying their own story. Some were teary-eyed, others nodding in silent understanding. She saw herself in their eyes, and it was in that moment that she knew she had found her purpose. She was here to help others heal, to give them the courage to speak their truth, just as she had. "I didn't just survive," she told the crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm living, and I'm here to tell you that you can too. You're not alone." The applause that followed was not for her. It was for all of them, the survivors, the warriors, the ones who would rise again. Lorena smiled, finally understanding the impact her journey could have. She had turned her pain into power, her fear into a fight, and it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who needed a voice. As she left the stage, Maria stood waiting for her. She pulled Lorena into a tight embrace, a smile breaking across her face. "I'm so proud of you." Lorena nodded, her heart full. "We're doing this together." She had found her strength, and in doing so, she had created a legacy, not just of survival, but of hope, of healing, and of the unwavering belief that no one ever has to face their darkness alone. What do you think of Lorena Bobbitt's story and the shocking act of self-defense? From which region are you watching this video? Take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story and its impact? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories and in-depth discussions.